Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are right now? Say the hour and the minute. Now imagine a town where the minutes have been stolen. The wall clock above the switchboard has no minute hand at all, just an hour hand that points and waits, and yet whole lives here were proven and paid by the minute. That is the first thing you need to know about this story. The second is a shoebox, found in a cellar behind a fallen rack of dry batteries, filled with thin cardboard call tickets that smell like lamp oil and old apples. Each one says a voice existed at a certain hour. Several insist the same voice existed in two places at once. The box came from the telephone exchange on Courthouse Row, a two-room building with a coal scuttle by the back door and a sign that says, "Long distance," while the nearest city is a full day by wagons. I got the box because the roofers had pulled the tar paper and found a mouse highway above the ceiling. One kick and the soffit gave up a clatter of dead bees, pencil stubs, and these tickets, filed by night, forgotten by day. Tucked beside them was a ledger, thin as a catechism, bound in black cloth that had absorbed a generation of tobacco breath. On the first page, neat as stitching, someone wrote, "The Night Book." If you have never seen a manual switchboard, picture a door studded with brass coins. Each coin is a jack leading to a house, a store, or a line shared by a dozen farms. The operator sits on a stool, plugs a cord into one coin to answer, plugs the other end into the coin that matches the number you say, and then rings. 2 long, 1 short means the mill office. 1 long, 2 short means the sheriff. Everybody with ears can count a ring on a party line, which is why polite people lift the receiver only when it is for them, and impolite people learn a great deal for free. The night operators here were sisters, Lila and May Dalton, who could tie 3 conversations together with their eyes closed. Lila was the one with the quick smile. May had a neat scar in her eyebrow from when a fuse blew and threw a spring across the room. They worked the midnight to dawn span when the valley is honest and its paperwork is not. Their job was to keep the cords from tangling and the hours from bleeding into one another. They dressed their hair alike and could make a storm behave with nothing but a hand on the rheostat. I opened the night book and saw the sisters in its habits even before I saw their names. Each night began with a ritual inventory, batteries charged, magnetocranks oiled, clock wound, and then the calls were logged with an operator's shorthand that makes no sense until it makes all the sense there is. 1210A, mill to sheriff, line clear. 1212A, boarding house to doctor, pulse weak. 1215A, mill to mill office, internal, no answer. On the second line of that page, someone had penciled a note beside a call that rode the western trunk. Do not repeat. Below it, the same number, the same caller, the same hour. Repeated. The clock, without a minute hand, hung above the board like a dare. You could still hear minutes even if you could not see them, because a magneto ring takes a second to wind and a second to unwind, and a timid caller adds a breath between tries. Lila could tell whether a man was calling from the mill or from the depot by the way he spun the crank. Mill men turned with impatience. Depot men turned as if spinning a promise. That kind of knowledge should make a town safer. It did the opposite. Because once a town learns that a voice can be logged, it learns to borrow that voice's time. On the third night in the book, a pattern sticks its head above the brush. 105A, Carter residence to mill office, message left. 105A, Carter residence to mill office, message left, again. 106A, mill office to inspector's room at the boarding house, acknowledged. The first two are identical. Same caller, same destination, the second written in a slightly firmer hand, as if Lila, or May, wanted the carbon to show through to the ticket beneath. 2 tickets now live for the same call. The mill book would later show that Mr. Carter was on the wire during an accident petition, and the insurer's ledger would agree he was awake and responsible. The shift time card says he was also on site at the mill. The deputy's report puts him at neither, but that report will be corrected after a polite conversation. May believed in accuracy the way a nurse believes in temperature. She made marks I would know anywhere. A small slash when a line went noisy, a dot when 2 voices overlapped, a triangle when a third party listened on a farmer's party line and forgot to breathe. The triangle appears beside 3 calls in a row on a Thursday, and then a pencil line wraps all 3 with a note written small and neat. Same cough. You do not need eyes to prove a person. Sometimes a cough is more signature than a name. Someone used that cough in the spring of 1911. In the night book, the trunk line to the city wakes at 2:48 a.m. 2 long, 1 short, to wake the operator at the far end. Then a tight hand writes, "Insured, party, notified." 2 minutes later, the same trunk number with the same code, the same tight hand, "Insured party notified," again. If you only look at the tickets, you will think the second call was a confirmation, a decent habit. But in the margin, May wrote a thing that only makes sense if you grew up on a party line. An echo with a delay that isn't ours. In other words, one of those calls was not a call at all. It was a recording made from a line spliced into the trunk for the purpose of proving later that a voice had been present. If you think our great-grandparents did not have recordings, you have forgotten that wax remembers, and so does a rushing wire when there is a second coil in the room. Lila wrote differently. When someone tried to borrow time, she drew a small open circle beside the hour, a habit left over from a summer she had spent copying seeds for a catalog. An open circle meant expected growth. It appears next to a rash of calls from the mill office to a foreman's boarding house bed. The first few make sense. A boiler does not care what hour it is. The 4th, 5th, and 6th all stamp the same minuteless hour. 3 tickets later, there is a second slab with a bold carbon, and the word duplicate faint as a conscience above it. The foreman's pay envelope will later reflect 3 call-outs. The mill's claim will reflect 3 emergency decisions. The family's calendar will reflect a husband home in bed and answering questions through a door. A telephone office is supposed to be the town's throat. But a throat can be trained to clear at the right moment, to swallow a name, to cough on cue. The night book kept 2 worlds side by side. On the left page, the calls and the hours. On the right, a column titled Drops. A drop is when a line falls silent because a plug slips, or a wire goes damp, or a human being decides that this call should not go through after all. Many drops are innocent. A few are not. On a page in July, 3 drops sit underlined. Mill Sheriff, Sheriff Inspector, Inspector Mill. In the margin, a hand has written satisfied, then erased it so the paper looks rubbed thin. That word does not belong to operators. It belongs to men who like outcomes. You want a face now. The night book gives you one. It is in a photograph that slid behind the last tickets like a flake of ash behind a stove. The picture shows the sisters on their stools, Lila with her hair in a pragmatic coil, May with the scar like a neat hyphen over her eye. Behind them, the board glows with those brass jack coins, 2 cords looped in the operator's hands like a choice caught mid-air. On the wall, the clock smiles with only 1 hand. It is not broken. The minute hand was removed. The foreman said the tick rattled the glass and disturbed night work. If you erase minutes from the wall, you make minutes negotiable on paper. A town will forgive a great deal if the mill runs and the pay envelope fattens. It will forgive even the sound of a third cord being inserted quietly at 2 in the morning. It will forgive that the sheriff's phone can be made to ring without the sheriff hearing it, which is what the sisters called a blind wake. It will forgive that a call ticket can be made in triplicate if a second carbon is slipped beneath the pad. But a town does not forgive when a child is sick and the doctor's line drops twice, then connects on the third try too late for what needed doing. In the night book, that night's column for drops is boxed hard in pencil, and beside it a sentence written slowly so that no one would mistake the hand. Mill to doctor rang the house, 2 long, 1 short. The ring only reached the hall. The sisters did not run a scam. They ran a board where other people attached their intentions. That is the hardest thing about a switchboard. You are a witness, not an author, until the moment you realize that witnessing is the act that makes a lie work. The night book shows that moment when May begins to mark not just what happened, but what would be claimed. Proof made is her phrase, and she uses it beside calls that did not need to happen except as receipts. At the very back of the ledger, folded so many times it opened like a reluctant flower, there is a route map of the trunk lines from our town to the city. Pencil marks show a point where 2 lines were spliced for a week in late March. If you hold the paper to the light, you can see a faint bruise where an eraser has rubbed out a name. Above that bruise, someone wrote a single word with a different pencil, the kind clerks use when they want graphite to glare. Exchange. It is the same hand that wrote, "Do not repeat," beside the twin calls in spring. One of the sisters left that mark. I do not know which. I only know they wanted the next set of eyes to see what the town had trained itself not to see. Before I shut the box, I looked under the bottom board and found one more thing. A narrow strip of paper with 4 holes like a poor man's music roll, the kind used to teach trainee operators a ringing rhythm without tying up the actual line. 2 long, 1 short. If you put your fingernails through the holes and tap them on the desk, you can make the call pattern that raised men from their beds and made alibis for them in the same breath. Try it now, wherever you are. Tap twice, then once. Hear how convincing a habit sounds when you can do it in your sleep. That is what we are up against. A town that learned to ring itself awake to things that only ever happened on paper. The sisters said nights have personalities. Monday nights are sober. Friday nights lie about their names. Storm nights bring good listeners because thunder frightens even men who pretend it does not. The week that mattered began on a Tuesday with a heat that made wires sing. At 11:45, May tested the trunk to the city and wrote the hour down the way she always did, a small notch in the margin. At 11:49, a man spun 2 long, 1 short from the mill, and Lila answered with her pleasant voice that made instructions feel like help. The man asked for the inspector's room at the boarding house. Lila rang it and marked a circle beside the line because the man breathed like he was reading from a page. You cannot fake work on a switchboard. Your fingers tell on you. Lila's moved without thinking. Answer, plug, ring, cut, listen, move. But watching May became a second kind of listening. May kept her pencil on the paper even when she was not writing. It hovered like a stethoscope above a chest. Between the mill and the boarding house, her pencil paused. In the night book, the pause is a faint dent before the word connected. She had heard something that would chase them through the week. At 12:05, the mill called the sheriff. 2 long, 1 short. The sheriff's set is an old wall phone with a receiver heavy as a ladle. It rattles when you lift it too quickly. The nightbook shows connected, then a thin slash that means a second voice on the line. Party listen. May waited. Sometimes she would cough politely, and the eavesdropper would hang up out of embarrassment. This one stayed. After a breath and a scrape, the extra receiver settled just enough to say somebody needed to know what was being said without being seen to know it. The sheriff spoke slowly, the way men do when they are aware they are being overheard and do not mind. He said he would come if the mill could prove urgency. Proving urgency is what the tickets were for. At 12:13, the mill called the company's claims agent in the city. Lila wound the magneto for the trunk and watched the tiny needle on the line meter lay down like a tired cat. The connection took, but the voice that answered rode in with a neat delay. Not the elastic lag of far wire, but the metronome space you get when a voice goes into a mouthpiece twice before coming out once. May wrote, "Delay not ours." At 12:15, the foreman's boarding house rang. Then again, 3 tickets stacked like shingles. The first shows the open circle Lila used when she felt a call being built. The second shows carbon darker than habit. The third shows a faint word above the line, duplicate, in May's neat hand, and then a small box around the hour as if to save it for later. Men can be lifted from bed 3 times on paper without ever putting on their boots. A ledger prefers men who are always available. A house prefers men who sleep. The sisters were not naive. They knew mills liked to choreograph events, so that on paper a decision had been made an hour before a boiler hissed. They knew men asked to be rung at the start of a shift, and again at the moment a petition needed witnesses. But this week was different. Calls paired like shoes. The same number appeared twice, with the same destination, and a third ticket showed the same pair claimed again by the trunk. It was as if the town had learned how to copy its own voice and send it traveling in separate directions. At 1 in the morning, a farmer on the party line lifted his receiver to listen, which meant the sisters had to decide whether to chastise him or treat him like an unpaid guard. May let him hang for a beat, then rapped the key to say, "Stay quiet." What he heard was a routine that should have felt boring. The mill's office calling the inspector's room to confirm a midnight inspection had been scheduled, and then the boarding house calling the mill to confirm a midnight inspection had been performed. Both statements could not be true at once. May drew a small triangle and wrote "same cough" under it. The cough belonged to the clerk who had asked her last month whether ringing the city cost more at night. He coughed like a man apologizing in a church. Lila tried a trick she liked when things felt wrong. She broke the habit of the ring. 2 long, 1 short is the mill. She gave it 1 long, 1 long, 1 long, an error no operator would make by accident. If the man at the desk was truly there, he would wait and ring back to report the mistake. If a recorder was playing back to prove presence, no ring would come. No ring came. Lila blinked at the clock with no minute hand and reached for the nightbook before her fingers remembered the cord. By 2, the sisters were working like 2 hands of one person. May listened for delays and drew circles when she smelled a constructed hour. Lila announced connections in a voice that tested the room more than the line. They knew the trunk could be spliced. The night lineman, a quiet man named Harmon who carried a climbing belt like a priest carries a stole, had told them once that you could ride the outside cable and hear where a second coil had been wrapped by a man in a hurry. The wire would hum like a jar lid when you hit the splice. Harmon was out on the ridge that week. He told Lila 2 nights earlier that he had heard humming where there had never been humming. At 2:48, a long-distance call went cityward, with insured party notified, written in the tight hand the claims man favored in his letters. At 2:50, the same line, the same phrase, the same tight hand. The nightbook shows May's note, echo. Lila wrote a circle, and then, for the first time, a small question mark beside it. A habit is one thing. An imitation of a habit is another. You do not need modern devices to copy a call. Put a wax cylinder next to the transmitter, hold the horn in the dark, and crank. The second call will sound like the first with a thin glass skin over it. May heard the glass. Around 3, the sheriff's set chimed empty. The sisters cranked again. No answer. Then a half ring came back, a blind wake. The switchboard showed his line alive. The room did not. The sheriff was out in his car blowing his horn at the mill gate to let witnesses hear that he had responded, while his wall phone winked alive to sign that a call had been received. There is a dignity in being summoned in person. There is a profit in being summoned on paper. This week preferred the latter. At 3:13, a doctor's wife rang to say the baby's lungs were tight. The nightbook shows the call, then a drop, then another drop, then connected. May boxed the drops hard in pencil and wrote "rang the house," 2 long, 1 short, ring reached only the hall. That note matters because it is the first time she wrote about the space inside a house as if it were part of the line. If a ring lands on a hall phone and not the bedroom set, a call can be said to have been made without the person who needs it hearing it. That is the difference between contact and proof. By 4, the sisters had noticed a second routine. The boarding house clerk had begun stamping the bottom of late visit chits with a time that matched the top of duplicate call tickets. The clerk did not own a clock that precise. He owned a friend who had learned to borrow times from a board. When the sisters noticed, they began to lay a second carbon beneath the pad for certain numbers, not to make more tickets, but to make a shadow of the hand that claimed them. On 2 chits from that week, you can see the truth the clerk did not intend to leave. The same loop of ink where a figure was traced rather than written. Harmon came in at dawn with gravel on his coat and news in his eyes. He had climbed the West Pole where the trunk line splits to the depot and the mill offices and found a length of fresh tape and a coil that did not belong to the telephone company at all. It belonged to a recorder's horn carried up in a satchel and hung like a wasp nest under the eaves of the mill office. He did not take it down. He did not have permission. He put his hand on it and felt it warm. Then he walked the ridge and found the same taped place where the line runs behind the boarding house. He said the city man's voice rides our wire whether we invite him or not. May asked Harmon to stand behind the board and listen while she made a test. She rang the mill with a wrong rhythm again, 3 longs. Then she rang the boarding house with 1 short, 1 long, 1 short, their private joke. On the trunk, she rang the city with 2 longs only. The mill called back with the correct pattern. The boarding house did not. The city answered with the exact words from 20 minutes before. Harmon closed his eyes and said, "That is not wire, that is memory." Lila wrote a sentence that did not belong in an operator's book. Proof made before event. Time will be fitted later. She underlined fitted. A fitted time is like a hem raised to keep a dress from dragging. It does not alter the cloth, only the way it is seen. The mill needed fitted times because an inspection that arrives after the accident is negligence, and an inspection that arrives before is prudence. A duplicate call ticket can move a minute without the minute hand ever touching the clock. At 5 the town yawned. Milkmen clattered. A train sighed. The boarding-house set rang again from the mill office, and May let it ring until the clerk lifted on the 20th pulse, then wrote another sentence not meant for the job. They will call the morning ledger a night book if we don't hold our own. She closed the night book and stared at the clock that had been taught not to count. Lila took the tickets and slid the darkest carbons under the shoebox false bottom with her thumbnail. The board hummed softly, like a jar lid if you touched it just right. Outside, a car horn sounded twice, like a magneto crank spun by a man who had learned to keep proof on his side. The morning after Harmon felt memory on the wire, May spread the tickets from the bad night like playing cards across the board shelf and began to copy times from 3 clocks that did not agree. The switchboard's wall clock showed only hours by design. The depot's master clock, wired to the telegraph, kept minutes that trains trusted. The courthouse clock lagged unless the janitor remembered to wind it on Thursdays. May took her pencil and made a private 4th clock in the margin of the night book, the one her ear kept, measured in breaths, crank turns, and the distance between a voice and its echo. She labeled it W for wire, D for depot, H for habit. Lila answered lines and kept callers polite with the tone that made instructions feel like help. While she worked, May tested the previous night's trouble against the depot time. She sent a messenger boy uphill with a request. At 2:50 by depot clock, telegraph the word apple to the exchange. The depot man obliged and clicked apple exactly when his second hand struck. The bell on the switchboard did not move. 10 counted breaths later, the trunk needle twitched and settled, and May wrote in her careful hand, "Delay to exchange." 10 long breaths. When she reversed the trial, ringing the depot at a set minute, the response came at once. The trunk, not the town, had been taught to hesitate when calls went a certain way. By noon, the mill foreman came in with that false calm the town had learned to recognize, hat in his hand and a compliment ready. He told the sisters the board had never sounded cleaner. He laid a box of sweet buns on the shelf and asked if they needed new felt for their headsets. Lila thanked him and said felt would be useful. May said the wall clock did fine without a minute hand because nights were for long thoughts, not small ones. The foreman said he had heard a rumor that the inspector in the city, he did not say claims inspector, he said inspector, wanted to visit, and sometimes visitors got confused by clocks that did not match. He offered to pay for a minute hand himself, a generous idea. May smiled and asked whether he preferred the minute hand to point at the truth or at the tickets. The foreman's smile stopped just short of his eyes. The sisters took turns sleeping in the afternoon. When May woke for her shift, she found a note from Lila pinned under the battery meter glass. Harmon found another coil behind boarding-house eaves. Foreman sent buns. Do not eat the ones with ribbons. May lifted the lid. 2 of the buns were tied in thin red silk, the kind factories use to dress up parcels sent to donors. She closed the lid and fed the buns with ribbons to the coal stove with a gentleness that would have made a cat forgive you. That night a new sound rode the party line, someone tapping a receiver hook in a pattern meant to imitate the switchboard's key. Tap, 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 tap. A clever listener asking for permission to hang. May answered in the only language a party line respects. She named him. "Good evening, Mr. Orrin. Your hook needs oil." The tap stopped. After a breath, the man said he had no business on the wire. May said he had business hearing the truth if the truth would do any good. He said truth did not raise wages and set his receiver down carefully enough to make no clack in the ledger. Around 1, The trunk hummed in that ugly way Harmon had named. Lila gave the mill its correct ring, but stayed her pencil over the ticket pad. The mill asked for the boarding house. Lila rang and counted breaths. May wrote D1103, W103. Then, on the next line for the duplicate call, she wrote D1103, W103 again, and shaded the W darker because the echo arrived inside the same breath as the reply, which is not how humans breathe. She drew her little open circle and then a second circle overlapping it. 2 circles became a diagram of the week, hours that had been asked to grow a second head. Harmon came in wet from the ridge and set a scrap of tape on the shelf. He had peeled it from a trunk splice. It smelled of pine rosin and tobacco. Not company tape, he said. Lila asked whether he could swear to that under a roof that liked polite answers. Harmon said he could swear to a wire's hum better than to a man's face, and that would have to do. They needed another witness with time in his hands. The depot telegrapher, Mr. Blaine, had the authority of steel schedules and a Western Union clock that clicked like an honest insect. Lila sent a boy with a card. Please come take coffee at 2. Bring your time. Blaine came with a tin cup and a look that said he had meant to keep out of other people's arrangements his whole life. He watched 3 calls knit and unknit across the board and listened to Harmon talk about hums. Lila asked him to tap Apple on the half-minute 3 times while she rang the city trunk. The first apple matched. The second came late by a consistent slice. The third landed early by exactly the same slice, as if someone had knocked a needle backward and then forward to dress a number. Blaine tapped his clock glass like a doctor taps a knee and said a delay that repeats is a design, not a condition. May turned to the nightbook and did a thing she had hesitated to do for months. On the right-hand page where she usually wrote drops, she made a new column and titled it Fittings. Under it, she wrote short sentences with the arithmetic of a seamstress. Mill sheriff fitted 2, foreman fitted +3, trunk city fitted 10. When Lila glanced and raised an eyebrow, May said, "We cannot chase what we refuse to measure." Lila nodded and went back to the chords with that steady left hand of hers that made hard things behave. At 2:30, the sheriff walked in, hat pushed back, thumb hooked in his belt, wholesome as a corn poster. He said he had received word of concern about the board and wanted to reassure himself. He stood just behind Lila's shoulder as if reading over her lesson. When the boarding house called, he admired the efficient connection. When the city called the mill exactly as a duplicate ticket predicted, he rubbed his chin and said, "Civic life depends on reliable communications." May asked whether civic life also depended on having a minute hand. The sheriff said he did not concern himself with clocks when engines and men needed him. May said engines and men needed minutes more than they needed praise. The sheriff looked at Harmon, who looked at the floor. When he left, he paused to admire the coal stove. Someone had cleaned it. The ribbon buns left no grease. He put a hand on the lid and said, "Nice and warm in here." May said not as warm as the West Pole. The sheriff took his hand off the lid and thanked them for their devotion to service with a smile that had met practice. That was the first night someone tried to bribe time with sugar. The second night, someone tried to frighten it. Just before 3, the board's left bank cut to a whisper. Not a drop, a choke. Lines that should have rung sounded like a hand over a mouth. Lila rapped the key twice, then again. Harmon ran out without his coat. May switched battery feeds to the spare and wrote choke at 2 by D, lines clear by 7 by W, and then she stopped because her own private clock refused to agree with the wall. Seconds had been rearranged and then returned like a rug tugged and smoothed. At dawn, Mr. Blaine returned with a small iron box like a lunch pail, Western Electric stamped discreet on the side. He set a wire recorder on the table and cranked it while Harmon made the hums happen. Ring the mill, ring the city, ring the boarding house by the wrong rhythm, ring the mill again. The wire sang. When he rewound and played it back, the room heard something it could not disbelieve. The second city call had the same intake of breath in the same place as the first, a tiny whistle through a chipped tooth. Men do not chip their teeth on schedule. Memory does. Now that they had a sound that could not be denied, the sisters faced a choice that had nothing to do with chords. Lila said they could take the recorder to the sheriff and watch it vanish into a bag labeled evidence. May said they could invite the sheriff into the room and read his name into the nightbook under fittings, and then ask him to initial the line. Harmon said names are heavy when they are spoken in the right room. Blaine said he would bring the inspector of telephones from the district, no relation to claims, and he would not warn him until he was already in the doorway. The foreman returned that afternoon with a second box of pastries and a roomer wearing its Sunday suit. He said he had been told the sisters were feeling unwell from night work, and that substitutes could be provided for the good of the town's nerves. Lila asked who had ever told a switchboard what nerves were. May said their nerves had learned to count without a minute hand and did not need sweet prizes to keep time. The foreman set the box down and, for the first time, did not pretend he would be back with more. When he left, Harmon tilted the lids and found 2 buns tied with wire instead of ribbon, a joke he threw into the stove with tongs and a small oath. In the quiet hour before shift change, the sisters did the most dangerous thing they had done yet. Nothing. They let the board hum. They did not challenge the trunk with wrong rings. They did not cough politely at eavesdroppers. They watched which numbers called when no one prodded them. The mill rang the city without preamble. The boarding house rang the mill twice without waiting for breath. The sheriff's line made the little wink of a blind wake at 10 past as if to keep a promise no one asked of it. May wrote a sentence at the bottom of the page in a hand meant to be read aloud later. When a town learns to make minutes from memory, it will need someone to remember on purpose. She pressed the pencil so hard the groove showed through on the page underneath. Lila slid the bad carbons into the shoebox false bottom and placed the wire recorder on top of them like a book laid over a sleeping child. Harmon checked the battery gravity and said quietly, "The line hums like it wants to talk to a stranger with a badge." Blaine looked at the depot clock and said the next train brings him at 11. Lila lifted her eyes to the clock with no minute hand and told it, not unkindly, that it would have to sit this one out. The district inspector of telephones arrived without a drum roll and with a toolbox that had learned the weight of real work. His name was Mr. Fisk, and he had the posture of a man who trusted plumb lines more than conversation. Blaine met him at the depot and did not let him ask questions on the walk. Questions, Blaine knew, teach guilty men how to arrange their answers. At the exchange door, Lila set out 3 cups and the wire recorder as if hosting an ordinary caller. May slid the nightbook to the far end of the shelf where a visitor could not pretend not to see it. Fisk listened. He did not interrupt Harmon's talk of hums or Blaine's clicks or Lila's wrong ring trick. When May played the wire and the same chip-tooth whistle repeated between the first and second city calls, he nodded once the way a carpenter nods when a board he suspected is finally shown to be warped. He asked for the mill's line map. There was none. He asked for the sheriff's complaint log. The sheriff had never needed one before. The valley ran on habit and hats. Fisk said, "Then we will borrow both, and we will do it in the order that leaves the least room to lie." They went first to the sheriff under pretext of checking the lightning arresters. The office smelled of saddle soap and old almanacs. On a shelf beside the desk sat a wooden stationery box with brass corners, the kind a tidy man buys himself the year he decides to be re-electable. Inside were 2 stacks, time cards of responses stamped with a rubber clock face, and call tickets the sheriff was not supposed to possess. May recognized the faint bruises of second carbons. Fisk asked gently why a peace officer kept duplicate tickets that originated at a private exchange. The sheriff said donors in the city liked promptness, and promptness liked paper, and paper preferred to travel in pairs. May lifted a ticket to the light. The rubber clock face wore its minute hand at 12, no matter the hour. She set it down as if it might overheat and burn. Fisk opened the lower drawer. There he found carbon books, thin as a spider's coat, with pages imprinted by hard pens. Doctor rang, sheriff answered, mill rang, sheriff at gate, inspector called, witness present. The dates danced politely around each other. One book bore a smear of coal, another wore a ring of coffee the size of the sheriff's cup. May laid one of her own carbons beside the sheriff's copy. The loops of ink were twins, too perfect. You can match a man's hand. You cannot match the weight he gives to the upstroke unless you are tracing through a leaf. The sheriff watched her do the arithmetic and chose to speak before she could. He said the county liked its files complete, and a complete file wants every call to have a shadow. Fisk said, a shadow is not a person. There are worse sounds than a drawer opening. One of them is a drawer not opening at all until its owner sighs and finds the hidden catch. Behind the catch lived a bundle tied with string and self-importance, insurance forms already filled, with only an hour blank. Attached to the top with a pin was a list of hours that would make each claim easiest to settle. Beside each hour, a little circle had been drawn, the kind Lila used when she smelled a constructed call. The sheriff said those circles were the mill clerk's notation, not his. May said paper traveling through your drawer learns your fingerprints whether you like it or not. Fisk folded one form once and put it in his toolbox. They crossed to the mill. The foreman met them mid-yard, with his hat brave on his head and a story already saddled. He said he had heard concerns and wanted to be helpful. He said he admired the sisters' vigilance and Harmon's dedication and Blaine's clock. He did not say he admired Fisk's toolbox. He took them to the office and showed a ledger that beamed with neatness. Inspections scheduled, inspections performed, calls placed, responses noted. May counted duplicate lines with a schoolteacher's patience. The second and fifth entries each lived twice with different destinations. The hours wore the same suit. Under the desk she found a cigar box that smelled like promises. Inside lay a small hand-cranked recorder with a horn like a tin teacup and a handful of wax shavings that looked like gray confetti. The foreman said public relations required testimonials. Fisk said testimonials do not normally ride the trunk line at 2:50 a.m. without breathing between sentences. Harmon stepped into the alley and whistled once, the low two-note that linemen use when they find a splice the company did not make. Fisk followed him to the west pole, climbed 3 steps, and touched the line with the back of his knuckles. He closed his eyes. When he spoke, the words carried no ceremony. That coil is not ours. He loosened the tape with his thumbnail and showed the little varnished wire that had eavesdropped like a moth. The foreman said, "Wires break in storms, and clever men improvise." Fisk said, "Clever men improvise in daylight where their work can be invoiced." At the boarding house, the clerk tried to sell them a polish of respectability. He displayed a stamped chit's ledger with a spine that creaked and a bottom drawer with more stamps, ready to keep civic life moving. May asked to see the room where the inspector from the city usually stayed. The bedspread was drawn neat as a forgery. On the sill were crescent dents where a hornfoot had rested more than once. Harmon scraped the paint gently with a blade and lifted a pinch of soft metal filings. Tin. He tapped the sill and listened to where the sound went. It went to the eaves, and from there to the trunk, and from there to the idea that a city voice could be manufactured locally whenever a paper wanted a witness. Back at the exchange, Fisk borrowed a corner of the switchboard shelf and laid the day's findings like parts of a single machine. The sheriff's rubber clock face that never left the 12, the foreman's recorder, the filings from the sill, a piece of tape that smelled of tobacconist's rosin, a duplicate ticket with ink loops too smooth to be human, and the wire's own memory of a chipped tooth. He did not make a speech. He drew a rectangle on a fresh sheet and labeled its sides with nouns: caller, witness, time, proof. Then he put each object on the side where it belonged. When he finished, there was no side left, empty. That is what a machine looks like when it has been used long enough to stop squeaking. Even a machine needs a witness with a pulse. Fisk sent Harmon to the ridge to fetch Orrin, the farmer who tapped his hook at night. The man arrived in his Sunday shirt, buttoned crooked, hat in hand, repentant and useful. He said he had heard the inspector's room being rung at 1:03 and at 1:03 again, while the footsteps in the hall did not move until 1:10. He said he had heard the mill office cough twice, in the same place in the same sentence, like a man reading himself aloud. He said he had not told the sheriff because the sheriff does not write down what a man like him says when it costs trouble. May wrote Orrin's sentences into the nightbook in a neat hand and underlined the words "Hall" and "Same." Fisk asked the sheriff to bring his stationery box to the exchange. The sheriff came with it under his arm and set it down like an animal he meant to keep obedient. Fisk pointed at the rubber clock, then at the wall clock with no minute hand. He asked which one the valley trusted. The sheriff said the wall clock suited the sisters and the rubber clock suited the file. Fisk said the file would suit the wall when the minute hand went back on. He took a small paper envelope from his toolbox and shook out a minute hand made for just that model. He had brought it because he did not trust the kindness of men who offer to pay for one. He fixed it to the spindle, wound the clock, and set it by Blaine's Depot, time to the minute. It ticked once, like a throat clearing. Lila looked at it as if a missing word had returned to a sentence she loved. By late afternoon, the sheriff had stopped smiling. He tried one last detour, an invitation to handle the matter with the discretion it deserved. Discretion is a velvet word, and it works until somebody brings string. Fisk pulled his measuring string from his vest and stretched it across the page where May had begun her fittings, -2, +3, -10. Then he measured the distance between those numbers and the rubber clock's still 12. He said discretion was the space between what happened and what went into the ledger. The string had just removed the space. The foreman arrived with a new version of helpfulness, a suggestion that the board be staffed by substitutes while technical matters were resolved. Lila said the board would be staffed by the two people who could tell a cough from a delay. May said substitutes would be welcome during daylight demonstrations when witnesses stood in the room. Fisk added that the law did not recognize substitutes appointed by the beneficiary of a delay. The foreman took off his hat and put it on again, and for the first time since the week began, looked at the cords and saw not compliance, but memory. Night blew in with heat, lightning scratching the far ridge. Harmon tightened guy wires until they sang. Blaine set his telegraph key to a slow, patient tempo. Orrin promised, in his way, to keep his ear and his hook honest. Fisk sharpened his pencil and wrote 3 words on the slate above the switchboard, in a hand you could read from the doorway. "We call back." May smiled without showing teeth. Lila reached for the first chord of the night. The wall clock's minute hand moved. In the nightbook, at the top of the fresh page, May wrote a single sentence to keep herself honest. "A call is a door you can knock on twice. Tomorrow, we see who answers both." They called it the reverse night, and it began with the minute hand finally earning its keep. At 8 sharp, by the depot clock and the wall clock together, May drew a line across the nightbook and wrote, "Back call begins." Lila pulled the top ticket from the stack the sheriff had hoped would never be read by anyone with a pulse. Each line that claimed a call had been placed would be called back at the same hour under witnesses. Same numbers, same patterns, same doors. If a man had put his voice on a wire at 103, that door would hear a ring at 103 and answer to its own name or listen to itself lie. Fisk positioned himself where the room became a crossroads, close enough to touch the chords, far enough to see every face. Blaine set his pocket watch beside the wall clock so no minute could pretend to be elastic. Harmon stood at the west window with his belt over his shoulder, watching the ridge for anyone who preferred a knife to an argument. Orrin claimed a chair near the door and promised to keep his hook quiet, unless asked. The postmaster came and placed the oak registry book on the shelf like a family Bible, turned open to today. They began with the mill's midnight inspection calls, the twins that had worn the same minute without sharing a breath. Lila gave the mill its correct pattern, 2 long, 1 short, and held the speaking key down so the room could hear the plainness in her voice. "Mill office, the exchange. At exactly 1:03 tonight, we are returning a call that your office claimed last night at 1:03. Please answer with the name of the person who spoke then." Silence stood like a man in a doorway, refusing to move. A second passed, then 2. Paper can be punctual. People are not. A clerk recovered first and said his own name with a cough that tried to imitate itself. May wrote the name with no dot or circle, only the hour. Fisk asked if the inspector's room at the boarding house would like to confirm. Lila rang the boarding house with the same pattern she had used all week, and waited. The clerk downstairs said the inspector had stepped out. May wrote absent, and that small, honest word made the room breathe. Next came the city trunk. Blaine tapped his watch glass with a fingernail. Lila spun the magneto with a measured hand. The needle lay down like a cat again, but the hum did not carry extra varnish. When the city answered, it was a sleepy operator, not the claims man with the chipped tooth. Lila announced the exchange, the hour, the purpose. The operator said she would try to reach the gentleman and place them on hold with the polite hiss that comes of distance honestly earned. No echo rode back, only the long wire breathing. When the gentleman finally came on the line, both cough and confidence were different. He asked which claim they were discussing. Fisk said the one he would prefer to discuss under oath. Then came the sheriff's blind wake. Lila rang his wall set, and its bell wheezed in the room like an old harmonica. The deputy, planted at the desk as if the chair grew him, lifted and said sheriff's office. Lila said the exchange was returning last night's midnight verification. Who received it? The deputy looked at the sheriff, who looked at the rubber clock that now had the shame of being set beside a honest minute hand. The sheriff said he had been on patrol and could not recall which of his men took the call. May wrote uncertain under the hour and boxed it. The box looked like a small coffin for a habit. They worked the line like a harvest, household by household, ticket by ticket. When the paper claimed a ring had been placed to a house with a hall phone, someone in that hall had to answer tonight and repeat the name he had used last night. Twice a sleepy boy tried to be his father, and twice his mother came to the phone and told the truth with the sharpness fatigue gives decent people. When a ticket claimed a doctor had been rung 3 times in a row, Lila rang his line once and waited with every person in the room listening to steps. Steps arrived. When a ticket claimed a foreman had been called from bed thrice in 1 minute, Lila called once, and the boarding house keeper said the foreman had been at the window smoking for 10 minutes already, and would not be fooled into inventing sleep for anyone. Midway through, the mill sent a runner to suggest that the exchange was interfering with production. Fisk told the runner the exchange was repairing production, which had learned to walk with someone else's legs. The runner left, returned with the foreman, left again when he saw Orrin and Harmon in the same room as Blaine and the postmaster, and returned no more. The board hummed. The minute hand moved. The night book filled up with words that were not poetry, but would keep better than speeches. Present, away, no answer. Answered by wife, answered by son, answered by clerk. Unknown voice, claims to be, refuses to say. The honesty of small words cleaned the day like rain rinses a porch. Then the hum changed. Harmon heard it first and took the window latch in his palm without looking away from the ridge. The board's left bank went thin again, a choke that made the mill's line sound like a mouth covered by a polite hand. May rapped the key twice, once for the line, once for whoever had his fingers in it. At that second, the depot's telegraph clacked apple, uninvited. Blaine had not touched his key. He looked at his hands to be sure of them. Fisk stepped to the cords and changed batteries with the blunt efficiency of a man who had worked fine metal with cold fingers in worse weather. The hum backed down as if someone had decided they did not want to be caught doing anything that required them to explain a coil and a roll of tape. May returned to the list. Names answered. Hours admitted to their owners. The house with the hall phone took its ring, and the man in the bedroom marched out in his shirt sleeves to the set and said he would be counted for himself from now on. Lila smiled into the mouthpiece like a nurse who has seen a fever break. Not by persuasion, not by punishment, by the ritual of calling and answering under light. Around 11, Fisk called for the last demonstration, the one that would break something cleaner than anger. He set the wire recorder on the shelf and cranked it alongside the trunk. Lila rang the city and asked for the claims gentleman by name. The operator tried and could not find him. Fisk played back the wire from the bad night, the 2 calls with the same chip-tooth whistle caught between syllables. He let the room hear the whistle twice. Then he stepped to the board, rang the boarding house by the wrong rhythm, and let the horn in the inspector's window answer with the same recorded sentence it had been made to answer with all week. When the sentence reached the room, the wire recorder caught it too. He rewound and played both, last night's stolen time and tonight's caught-in-the-act reply, one after the other, so the pitch and the breath and the lie lay on the shelf like two identical tools engraved with different initials. Even the sheriff looked down at his hands. At midnight, with the list nearly done, someone tried the door. It was not a knock. It was the slow insistence of a key that had always worked and had just now found the tumblers unfamiliar. The postmaster stood and put both palms on the oak book as if it were a threshold. Orrin did not rise. He shifted his boots so his chair scraped, which is a farmer's way of saying no. The key withdrew. Feet went away faster than they had come. They ended the back calls at one with a house that had never used the telephone but had been called on paper 3 times. Lila rang the number assigned to the unused set, and the empty instrument on the wall answered with its bell, because brass is obedient. No voice came. May wrote instrument only. No human answer. She underlined human. The room let itself exhale. Fisk tied the return tickets with string and wrote returned on the bundle. He tied the duplicate tickets with string and wrote claimed on the bundle. He put the two side by side like matched weights on a scale. He did not announce a verdict. He said a sentence that a town can keep in its pocket without splinters. Tomorrow, anyone who wants to argue can pick up either bundle and carry it to any door and ask for a voice. The sheriff asked whether the board intended to keep performing such ceremonies. May said the board would do what the board had always been meant to do: answer, connect, and write down only what breath makes. Lila said the board would also from time to time call back, since memory had learned to pretend to be live. Blaine said the depot clock would be happy to lend minutes when a wall needed truth to lean on. Harmon said the ridge would be walked every dusk and every dawn until the hum forgot how to lie. Before they broke, the foreman came in once more, hat in hand, and story unsaddled. He looked at the recorder and the tape and the filings and the minute hand that dared to move. He looked at the bundles of tickets, equal as bookends, and the witness book open like a mouth that had learned to pronounce. He said there had been misunderstandings and that he lamented any inconvenience caused. He said the mill would no longer require after-hours verifications. He did not say why. Fisk asked whether he would like to initial that statement in the night book. The foreman held the pencil and could not make it go where a man's name has to go when it joins itself to a sentence meant for daylight. He set the pencil down with a care that would not bruise it and left. When the door closed behind him, May wrote a line along the bottom margin meant for no one but time. The minute hand is back. If a man wants proof now, he must borrow it from a clock that can hear him. Lila laid the last ticket in the returned stack and blew out the lamp nearest the window. The board hummed like something relieved. Orrin put on his hat and said the sound of a number answering to its door was better than prayer. Blaine checked the depot watch and said the second hand had felt longer tonight. Harmon said lines remember the hands that touched them. These would remember being asked to tell the truth. Fisk closed the toolbox and slid the night book half an inch closer to the edge of the shelf, where anyone entering would have to choose either to read it or knock it to the floor. He drew the string from his vest and measured nothing, because nothing needed measuring anymore. Then he did the one theatrical thing he allowed himself all week. He reached up and tapped the minute hand with one fingertip. It moved because it must, not because anyone had asked it to serve a story. And that, in a room that had been making minutes out of memory, felt like a small but permanent repair. Sunday opened like a ledger someone had forgotten to close. Church bells kept their hour, the depot clock kept its minute, and the wall clock at the exchange ticked where everyone could hear it. Lila and May propped the front door wide and set the night book on the shelf at elbow height, with a pencil beside it, the way you leave bread and salt for a guest. Fisk wrote a sign in a hand a far farmer could read. Names may be spoken here. Paper will listen. The first to arrive were the people with small angers and large politeness. A woman who had been rung 3 times on paper, but once in life asked what would become of those 2 extra hours. Leela said, "Hours do not perish. They go back to the clock." May added that any money earned by those hours would be returned to the side of the ledger that had been made hungry by the trick. The woman set her hand on the minute hand's glass as if testing a fever, and said that seemed like the only sermon she needed to hear that morning. Ambrose brought his chalk and wrote a short receipt on the window. Slates delivered 4 boxes. Coal vouchers matched. Returns canceled. He left the smudges on purpose, so a passerby could lay a fingertip in the dust and feel how easily a number is moved when it travels without a hand. Blaine leaned a timetable against the shelf and tapped where trains assume time is honest. He told anyone who asked that a schedule is nothing more than a town's willingness to agree about a minute. The sheriff came without his rubber clock and with the look of a man who has finally heard his own boots. He stood where the light could not mistake him for anyone else and said he would like to speak before others did. He did not confess. Confessions are for courts. He admitted that he had treated paper like a rain barrel, useful in drought, impressive to visitors. He said the barrel had leaked into places where a town ought to be dry. He said he was ready to sign the parts of the book that asked for his weight, but only if he could also sign where he would carry boxes and coal back uphill with his own hands. Fisk passed him the pencil. The sheriff wrote his name once at the bottom of a page that held the word fittings, then once under a list titled errands. He did not ask for a blotter. He let the ink dry on its own because patience is how you test an intention. The foreman did not come in. He stopped at the door and touched the lintel as if testing the threshold for splinters. He sent a clerk instead with a letter that had learned contrition without learning nouns. Fisk handed the letter to Orrin. Orrin read it aloud, slowly, as if the room were a field that needed even furrows. It said misunderstandings had occurred and adjustments would be made at the earliest convenience. Orrin looked up and said, "Fields do not plant themselves at their earliest convenience." He folded the letter and slid it under the minute hand's dome. The hand moved without help. The clock did not apologize. Around noon the square filled for a different kind of service. There was no sermon and no hymn, only a line of people who had decided to let a register record them the way a voice does when it does not perform. Lila asked each to say a name and a door. May wrote both as they were spoken, not as they had been spelled by a clerk with a habit. When a woman said she was called Bertie by everyone but her husband's sister, May wrote Bertie and left the sister to make her own page. When a boy said he had 2 first names because his father liked one and his mother liked the other, Lila asked which name he wanted the wire to ring and handed him the pencil. He printed his choice larger than any name on the page. People stepped aside for one another as if making room for a fuller margin. Fisk did not lecture about statutes or exhibits. He did a simple thing and called it enough. He laid the bundles on the table, returned tickets and claimed tickets, and set a scale between them. Anyone who wished could lift either stack and carry it to a door. Many did. Some came back red-faced because their house had been used by a number that did not live there. Some came back laughing because the instrument had rung like a trained bird with nobody to answer. A good laugh is a disinfectant. Some did not come back until evening because a door had offered them coffee and a story about a night nobody in the room had heard before. Paper purges better when it is asked to go walking. Harmon took Fisk to the ridge once more, not to point at tape, but to let him hear what quiet sounds like when a line has been relieved of its second coil. He clamped his belt, climbed, and pressed his ear. The wire sang the unadorned song of distance. No varnish, no jar-lid rattle, only the small hiss of air sliding past copper. He tied a fresh tag to the pole and wrote a date on it in his carpenter's print. He pinned a second tag lower where a boy could read it if he wandered. Poles that mark their own truth become bad places for secrets. Back below, Blaine set the wire recorder on the shelf one last time and made a record that was mostly silence, punctuated by names read clearly by people reading themselves. He wound it to the beginning, put a scrap of paper into the spool box, and wrote, "Play me when someone says the old way was cleaner." He put the box under the shoebox with the false bottom and smiled at Lila, who had taught him to hide things where an honest person would eventually find them without instructions. By late afternoon, the town had begun to act like a place that remembered how to behave when numbers sat at the table rather than in the attic. The boarding house clerk spent an hour at the sill with a brush and a tin of paint filling the crescent dents. He did not speak to anyone. He just filled and sanded and filled again until the next person who put a horn there would have to work hard to make it stay. The mill yard unlocked a cupboard and distributed wrenches that had been kept for visitors. The foreman allowed Harmon to cut the illegal coil in daylight with a knife that did not tremble. He said there would be no more after-hours verifications. He said it as if brass could forget a pattern. Brass cannot forget. People can learn a better one. Ruth brought her class in their Sunday shirts and let each child ring the exchange, once with two long, one short, then answer from the far end of the board by running around the table and lifting a second receiver. They learned with their hands how a call is both a request and a reply. They learned with their laughter that you cannot trick a good wire into being two places at once without making it hum like a guiltier instrument than it is. They put their small fingers on the minute hand's glass and watched it move in steps that did not speed up for anyone. Ruth wrote on the slate 3 words that had outlived their week: count, compare, correct. She did not write confirm. She said the town had proved enough. Correction is how proof behaves when it grows up. Toward evening, the inspector of claims finally came in from the city, late, tired, with a suitcase that had never been asked to carry anything heavy. He spoke in phrases polished by other rooms. He said he looked forward to collaborating on an orderly process that preserved consistency and delivered confidence to stakeholders. May handed him the returned bundle. He asked what it contained. She said doors that would answer to their names. He set the bundle down as if it had teeth. Fisk asked whether he would like to hear a record. The man declined on the grounds that he had a train. Blaine said the train would be glad to have him at the minute printed in the timetable. The man checked his watch and discovered the timetable was faster than his forgiveness. He left a card that looked important and walked quickly toward the part of the platform where nobody waits with a question. The sheriff came back at dusk with his sleeves rolled and a boy leading a mule with sacks the color of coal. He had already delivered 2. He would deliver 2 more. He did not do it to buy back anything. He did it because once your name sits beside a number, it becomes lighter work to carry the number yourself than to ask someone else to carry your story for you. He nodded at Orrin. Orrin nodded back like men who have both been wrong in different directions and met in the middle. Lila closed the switchboard covers one by one, the way you close the eyes of a good instrument after a long day. She left the wall clock wound, and the minute hand, lit by a lamp, turned low. May placed the nightbook back on the shelf, but not all the way against the wall. She left enough hanging over the edge that a hand could choose to pick it up or knock it to the floor. Choice is proof's last teacher. Fisk wrote one page for the file he would send to the district. It was all nouns and small verbs. Wire recorder captures duplicate breath. Unauthorized coil removed in daylight. Rubber clock face retired. Minute hand installed and set to depot time. Night operators continue in post. Sheriff initials fittings and errands. Mill withdraws after-hours verifications. Community register open. He signed it with a carpenter's signature and tore off a carbon. He handed the carbon to the postmaster and told him to put it under the glass on the oak counter so people had something dull and solid to look at when memory made itself dramatic. Before they closed, May did a small odd thing. She took the strip of training paper with the 4 holes, the poor man's music roll, and set it on the board shelf. She tapped it out with her fingernails. 2 long, 1 short. Then she tapped something new. 1 long, 1 long, 1 long. She said for emergencies, the wrong ring saved our week. Lila said emergencies are only practice for ordinary days done well. They smiled at each other like sisters who had taught a town to hear its own voice without pretending it came from a better house. Night settled. The ridge went dark without humming. The depot telegraph clicked good night to the next station down. The wall clock's minute hand turned a little more, and then a little more. In the quiet, the board hummed the way a jar hums when it is empty and clean and waiting to be filled with something useful tomorrow. The town did not become pure. It became legible. And in a place where numbers had learned to stand for people, people had stood up long enough that the numbers would not dare sit down again.